Okay, so I want to start today just to kind of reset, where we are. What is the major theme of these classes overall? And it is to have a view that's more of a macro, big picture view of American history, and not just a narrow definition of it begins in 1776, but it is part of a process that goes back to the beginning of human existence. And what I wanted to highlight is that when we got to the point of transitioning from hunter-gatherers, which we had been for 200 to 300,000 years, and we got to hunter-gatherer civilized society, as we refer to it today, there was a model for humans to exist. And when the human existence model of cooperation, because for that 200 to 300,000 years, for our species to survive, we had to cooperate with each other. You couldn't be in a competitive environment if there was no room for individualism. If you wanted to be the rugged individual, you were going to be dessert for the hyenas. You had to have other people with you so that when you found food, they could fend off the other predators who were coming to get your food. So it's very important to understand that we were, as a species, a very social animal, cooperative with each other, working together in an egalitarian world. And it was replaced. That model was replaced by the model of excess, wealth, and greed. And this was followed by other new models for the human experience. And it's important, these are the things that I want to highlight for what has been the focus of the past 10,000 years up to the modern day. And that is, we discovered animal husbandry. That becomes a model, using animals for the performance of work. The slavery model, where we are using humans for performance of work, therefore transforming humans into property and machinery. We have the uprooting of slaves model, moving enslaved peoples from their family, their home, their roots, in service of wealth-producing enterprises. We then got the racialization model. This is where despicable human behavior is rationalized and justified on the basis of skin tones. And this was during the African slave trade. When salt was being transported across the African continent, and then gold and other things. But so it goes back to the 9th century. And this concept of racialization is then expanded upon by white-skinned Europeans in the Atlantic slave trade. We also then have the plantation business model. This was developed by Spain and Portugal off the coast of Africa before the invasion of the New World, and it was a model of industrialization of slave labor. This is before the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution correlates with the development of machinery driven by steam, and the steam generated by coal. And so that machinery in the mid-18th century is what is the marking point of what we call the Industrial Revolution. But we had mass production and industrial level production happening long before that, beginning in the 9th century in Africa. So that the plantation business model is of the 15th century. And so it's important to understand that that model then gets transformed in other places, transported to other places. And so the human narrative, the human sense of what is right, what is wrong, how do we live, how do we think, agriculture came along, and we then moved away from I depend on you and you depend on me. Now I can grow my own food. I don't need you. Animal husbandry comes about. I can harness animals and use them as a source of food, but I can also harness animals for the performance of work for me. Lands, products extracted from the lands, and cattle equal wealth. This becomes a driving force in the human experience. And so what we get to is commodity mass production, commodities meaning something that everybody needs and everybody wants, opens a path to ever greater wealth. Warfare resulting from agriculture and the consequential concept of this is mine, I don't need you, that created slavery. Slavery is a direct product of warfare. Slaves then equated to animals and used for work in producing wealth. These became ideas that were accepted and became normalized. And so what's the key today out of all of this? When we get to today, what's the key? The key is find a commodity that everyone must have. Kill and fend off any competition. So you have complete control over that commodity. Pick whatever commodity you want. Oil, salt, tobacco, sugar. It's a commodity. Purchase government protection. If I look at a sporting event and I own the referees, I win the game. So you purchase government protection. Extract the maximum wealth. Operate with no moral constraint, such as, hey, that country has oil and I need it. We can invade. Come up with whatever reasons you want. I want you to invade and I want to take control over that oil. Murder, terror, all kinds of things. There's no limit. And it's important for you to understand there are people who have no inhibition, no restraint on things like that. Because for many people, they would say, hey, that's out of bounds. I wouldn't do that. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about those who want to be the titans of the world. So that's the overall theme. And what I'm trying to highlight is how that has played out in the American experience. Let me get this one here on the current slide. And there we go. Stop. And then I'd have to come here. I knew this would happen. Let me get that. Share that screen. And no, it didn't do it, did it? Well, okay, I'm going to have to try this again. Hold on. Sometimes it's not easy to navigate.
Would it help for me to tell you what I see? No.
No.
Okay.
Hang on. Let me get back over here. Now it should come up properly there. Okay, now you see the history of the United States?
Yes, it's a PowerPoint, but not in full screen.
Okay, so now we should be in full screen.
Settler colonialism.
Right. Okay, so for today's class, the next item of the 24 items is settler colonialism. Settler colonial, it's important to understand, we talked about what happened in England with the Enclosure Acts and the Transportation Act. Understand that when Spain goes along Africa and they are trading and they're bullying and they're trying to create plantations and that sort of thing. And Spain then moves into the New World and starts colonizing the New World. That becomes a model, an example for England, who is in competition with Spain. We're talking 15th century, time of Columbus, just after Spain finishes its fight with Islam. And they are then going to expel everyone from Spain who is not Catholic. So they want to get rid of all the Muslims. They want to get rid of all the Jews. They want to get rid of everybody who is not Catholic. So Spain is on a religious mission, and they are colonizing other parts of the world. England sees this, and England wants to do some similar things. And so England looks to Ireland. And what does England do? They've had the enclosures have started with in Scotland and in Wales, and they are now going to take Scots who are Protestants, and they're going to send them into Northern Ireland, where the Catholics live, and they're going to muscle them out of the way. They're going to try to eliminate the Catholics and put Protestantism there. But at the same time, they are going to create plantations. And so you get the Ulster plantation. This becomes really important because this is the phenomenon that we relate to as the Scots-Irish. And so you have two different populations. You have the Scots-Irish, who are representing the aristocracy. You have the Irish, who are the downtrodden and are subjected to pretty harsh handling. And because that is going to come into America. And that phenomenon is that we have of where England is colonizing Ireland. It is what we're calling settler colonialism there in England. They are going to then settle it, and they're going to take it over, and they're going to displace the indigenous population. Same thing happens in America. England comes and establishes colonies, again, following the lead of Spain. And then once they get it established, then England is going to start spreading out into the indigenous population and start removing and replacing them. I have an excerpt from a recent book by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Not a Nation of Immigrants. I'm going to send you some excerpts from her book that I think you may find interesting. And I think it's a really good book. It captures a great deal of what I'm talking about and others are. The issue, the historiography of settler colonialism is a big field in the world of American history today, and in world history as well, but particularly in American history. There's a whole lot being written by historians about settler colonialism. Here is what Dunbar Ortiz says. The history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism. The objective of settler colonialism is to terminate indigenous peoples as nations and communities with land bases in order to make the land available to European settlers. Extermination and assimilation are the methods used. This is the very definition of genocide. The word and its definition were created by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, published in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. So this concept, you see this land, you want this land, there are people on the land, and what you do is you're going to get rid of those people so you can take the land and use it for your own purposes. Come on, we're going to advance. I know you are. Okay, so the foreign invader establishes a colony, usually along a seaport. If you look at the original colonial settlements, they're all along the eastern coast. The colony is populated. Usually it's populated with indentured white slaves, as I refer to them. There are people who criticize that using that phrase. Whatever, they are not there willingly. And so, but they're populated, and England is the more aggressive in populating its colonies in comparison with the other colonial adventurists. And settler colonialism is in line with the doctrine of discovery. Again, what's issued by the Vatican to say it is moral, legal, spiritual to invade these lands, take them for your crown, and convert the people who are there to Catholicism, or you can kill them, particularly if they're Muslims. And so it is certainly, and it is, settler colonialism is really a phrase that spins the idea of brute theft of land. England, now, so what does England do? They say, they come, they set up shop, they say, this is our colony. Then they say, let's go survey these other lands that are occupied by the natives. They then define it as a part of the colony. And then they auction off that land to speculators. Speculators buy the land from England, and these are lands inhabited by indigenous peoples. They then divide the land into lots and they sell them and become rich. This is the source of wealth for Washington, Franklin, and others. And so those are people who are now taking these lands that the indigenous people have a claim to. And another source of people who are going to come and lay claim to lands that these indigenous people lay claim to are those who are indentured and are eventually freed once they have served out their time and they are freed. And they become known as squatters. It's not but from surveying the land, auctioning it off, parceling it. It is merely you left the farm today where you're working, you go to another spot, you place your stake in the ground and say, this is now mine. I'm a squatter and this is my land. And so we have freed indentures competed for the land simply by walking to where they decided they wanted to be. And who is getting displaced? Who's getting squeezed out of the picture? The indigenous peoples. Patrick Griffin, I think he's University of Virginia, his book, American Leviathan, Empire, Nation, and Revolutionary Frontier. Excellent book on settler colonialism. He says, the Ohio Valley continued to fascinate 19th century Americans, much as it had less than a generation before when Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Ben Franklin invested in its land, believing, like most of their fellow citizens, that America's future lay there. They had, from the very beginning, they kept saying, we've got to move west. Once we depleted the soils in Virginia, we got to start looking to the west and those lands, even though they're occupied by natives. And it was a relentless encroachment on the natives. And by the way, at the end of the American Revolution, people who were served in the war, how did they get rewarded? They were given land grants. Land grants meant go take more Indian land. We're going to let you go do that. So this is all of which fits the definition of genocide. And by the way, when it came for America to sign on to the Genocide Convention of the United Nations, the US Senate rejected it. They rejected it because they felt that that definition could be used against America based on what had been done to the Native Americans. And you can read congressional testimony to that regard. Let's have a look at some of this.
When we pass through the country between Pittsburgh and our nations, lately Shawnee and Lenape hunting grounds, where we could once see nothing but deer and buffalo, we found the country thickly inhabited and the people under arms. We were compelled to make a detour of 300 miles. We saw large numbers of white men in forts and fortifications around Salt Springs and buffalo grounds. Cornstalk, Shawnee.
In the aftermath of the American Revolution, the lands of the powerful Haudenosaunee nations were shrunk to little more than reservation islands. The front lines of the invasion moved west to the nations of the Ohio Valley, the Lenape, Shawnee, Miami, and others. Settlers flooded west, many of them Revolutionary War veterans paid with land grants by the government left bankrupt from the war. Supported by the new United States, they came prepared to fight for the land.
The people of our frontier carry on private expeditions against the Indians and kill them whenever they meet them. And I do not believe there is a jury in all Kentucky who would punish a man for it. John Hamtramck, Major, United States Army.
Over the next 20 years, through a series of battles and dubious treaties, the new United States laid claim to Indian lands on the frontier. Vast tracts were ceded to white settlement, including the future sites of Detroit, Toledo, Peoria, and Chicago.
The Native Americans had, at one point, would have been a force that could have fought off the invasion by the Europeans. But they failed to coalesce. The Europeans also knew how to drive wedges between any alliances that the indigenous peoples tried to form to fend off what the white people were doing. The white people knew how to make deals and drive wedges between them, much as we learned about in Bacon's Rebellion. And so post-Revolutionary War, they want to make an effort to fight back, but it is too late.
My heart is a stone, heavy with sadness for my people, cold with the
Brothers, we are friends. We must assist each other to bear our burdens. The blood of many of our fathers and brothers has run like water on the ground to satisfy the avarice of the white men. We ourselves are threatened with a great evil. Nothing will pacify them but the destruction of all the red men. Tecumseh, Shawnee.
In 1808, while the Shawnee prophet, Tenskwatawa, preached cultural renaissance at Prophetstown, his brother, Tecumseh, traveled throughout the territory, spreading the prophet's message, along with a political and military vision of his own.
The whites have driven us from the sea to the lakes. We can go no farther. The only way to stop this evil is for us to unite in claiming a common and equal right in the land, as it was at first and should be now. For it was never divided, but belongs to all. Unless every tribe unanimously combines to give a check to the ambition and avarice of the whites, they will soon conquer us apart and disunited, and we will be driven away from our native country and scattered as autumnal leaves before the wind. Tecumseh, Shawnee.
Tecumseh electrified his audiences. At one gathering, a nervous white observer reported seeing young men shaking with emotion, 1,000 tomahawks brandished in the air. William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, recognized Tecumseh's personal power and charisma and saw the Shawnee leader as a singular threat.
The implicit obedience and respect which the followers of Tecumseh pay to him is really astonishing, and more than any other circumstance, bespeaks him one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. If it were not for the vicinity of the United States, he would perhaps be the founder of an empire that would rival in glory that of Mexico or Peru. Governor William Henry Harrison.
Prophetstown's population swelled. But, despite Tecumseh's growing influence, he could not control the actions of all Indian leaders. In 1809, at one of many treaty conferences, Governor Harrison convinced leaders of the Miami, Lenape, and Potawatomi to sell 3 million acres of land in Indiana and Illinois. Tecumseh was outraged, considering those who signed the treaty guilty of treason.
No tribe has the right to sell a country, even to each other, much less to strangers. Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children?
Tecumseh went to Harrison and, in a volatile meeting, confronted the governor face to face.
Brother, I look at the land and pity the women and children. I am authorized to say that they want to save that piece of land. We do not wish you to take it. It is small enough for our purposes. I want the present boundary line to continue. Should you cross it, I assure you it will be productive of bad consequences.
But the settlements continued to expand, even onto the newly ceded lands. Tecumseh was convinced that only force would stop the American advance. To build a military resistance, he continued to travel tirelessly among the nations of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, while Harrison kept a nervous eye on his movements.
No difficulties deter him. For 4 years, he has been in constant motion. You see him today on the Wabash, and in a short time you hear of him on the shores of Lake Erie or Michigan or the banks of the Mississippi. And wherever he goes, he makes an impression favorable to his purpose.
In 1811, Tecumseh traveled south in an effort to bring the powerful Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek into the alliance. There, in village after village, he argued that Indian nations stood at the brink of disaster.
But it was too late to change it. And let's see if I get this to work. Through their revolution, Westerners created covenants that drew a number of conclusions that other Americans were also embracing. That race, not class, should represent the most salient marker of identity. That contempt for Indians and those of other inferior races could be valorized. that individual rights to life, liberty, and security should have sacrosanct status for white men, but only the wealthy could enjoy unfettered ownership of property. Stop that. To here.
Where today are the powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white man, as snow before the summer.
For decades, federal agents and Christian missionaries had pressured Indian nations to abandon their traditions and assimilate into white society. The policy, promoted by Thomas Jefferson and others after him, advocated intermarriage, religious conversion, and financial incentives to turn Indian people into Americanized farmers. In the South, U.S. policy was succeeding. Traditionals had been eliminated as a serious military threat, and American culture was spreading. The large southern nations, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, came to be known as the 5 civilized tribes. To the Americans, the most civilized of these were the Cherokee.
We call ourselves Aniyawiya, which is translated into the principal people. When the Creator made the world, He created these beautiful mountains here in the Smokies. And He needed someone to live here, someone who would take care of what He'd made and what He gave to us. And so He chose the Cherokee people.
The ancient Cherokee nation flourished in and around the Great Smoky Mountains, building their capital of Echota in the foothills southwest of present-day Knoxville, Tennessee. Echota was a peace town where no one could be harmed. But with each passing generation, there were fewer and fewer who clung to the traditional Cherokee lifeway. Many Cherokee became successful, modeling themselves after their American neighbors, living in 2-story houses on plantations, raising European crops, owning slaves, and educating their children in American schools. In 1817, a new national council formed with wealthy landowner John Ross as its principal elected chief. The centuries-old clan-based government was replaced with a republican state modeled after the American system. Echota, the venerated Cherokee peace town, was replaced as seat of government by New Echota in Georgia. In 1821, a man named Sequoyah completed an alphabet that committed the Cherokee language to writing. Soon they had their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix. But despite Cherokee efforts to coexist and United States government policies to bring Indian nations into the American way, it was a relationship marred by racism and greed. In the middle of a booming slave economy built around cotton, demand for land was growing. And the southern Indian nations still controlled vast areas. In 1828, Andrew Jackson, like William Henry Harrison, used his reputation as an Indian fighter to propel himself to the presidency.
Greed usually is the thing that makes people do things they wouldn't do otherwise. Gold was discovered down in Georgia.
Hundreds of miners illegally swarmed across the Cherokee border to lay claim to the vein. The Cherokee turned to the United States for protection. But President Jackson, himself a land speculator, removed federal troops from the area, telling Georgia officials, "Build a fire under the Cherokee. When it gets..."
I'll kind of says it all, I think, if, we share this, get this ready to go. We have to, let me just, there's good and bad people in the world, right? I mean, there are people who will commit crimes and bully and do all kinds of stuff. And we hope that we have laws that will be able to restrain bad behavior and punish bad behavior. It has nothing to do with their place of origin of their ancestors. It has nothing to do with the color of their skin, their sexual preference, their religion, all of that stuff of, the Jews are this, the blacks are that, and the Irish are this other, Italians, Catholic. I mean, there's hatred that's been spread about everybody to try to rationalize what someone is doing who is manipulating to add to their ever expanding wealth and power driven by greed. At the heart of all of it is greed, racial, religious, all that stuff. To be able to demonize people is not the problem. The problem is greed. Those things are but tools for the greedy to try to get people to stop looking at them and to support them. And we just have, it's all predicated on a lie. I mean, it's just, there are ways in which to discern actual fact. And when we look at these things and you tear it apart, it's easy to disprove notions of Jews are this, blacks are that, Catholics are this other thing, blah, blah, blah. It's easy to disprove it. But lies just, they get promulgated and promoted, and it helps those who have power and wealth. And because they have power and wealth, they have the ability to keep transmitting the message so that it becomes etched on the brains of people, even though it is founded upon nothing. George Washington got rich by killing Indians and stealing their lands. Let's look at how he's presented.
It's hard to imagine there would have been a United States of America without George Washington. He was there at the birth of the nation. He successfully guided it through war and nurtured it in peace. How did he do it? Not by being a great general, a potent political theorist, or even a clever politician. He was none of those things. And yet he was admired by generals, political theorists, and politicians. Why? Because he was a man great men trusted. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and so many others looked up to him. Literally. He was one of the tallest men of his era at 6'3". Add courage, integrity, and wisdom, and you have a truly impressive figure. Let's start with his courage. That was never in doubt. If anything, he had too much of it. Bold to the point of rashness as a young man, he fought for the British against the French over control of the Ohio Valley, then the westernmost point of the American wilderness. Throughout that conflict, known as the French and
I won't play the whole thing, but understand, he fought for the British in the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War benefited him and his brother, the president of the Ohio Company, who wanted that land. He then betrays the British, who he fought for. We call them traitors. He went to go fight for an insurrection against what he had considered his government. But they don't tell you any of that. I mean, but that is factual. That is what he did. And so we continue to have, and all those people who admired him, land speculator, land speculator, land speculator, got wealthy off of Indian land. Ben Franklin and John Adams, before the 1 year before the American Revolution, are spreading fake news, telling people through newspaper articles that the British are ginning up the black people to go and kill their slave masters. No evidence, no proof, no support for it. They go and they tell people the British are ginning up the Native Americans to come and kill women and children in the village. Again, no proof of that, nothing to support, but they are writing article week after week after week. It's the only way they could galvanize the colonists to fight against England, because they were not joined together in any kind of united front to do that. And so, before leading the Continental Army, George was a land surveyor. He then was a land speculator and then was a slave master. He is known as a great patriot, but little is known of his land speculation interest and his treatment of slaves. His interest in land led him to lobby for the French and Indian War, and that war benefited his brother, Lawrence, who was the head of the Ohio Company. Washington's father died when he was 11 years old. His brother Lawrence then took over as being his guardian, and he guides George and gets him a tutor and a basic education. He directs George to become a land surveyor, and he tells him to get military credentials because it will help advance your career, and it'll position you for marrying into money, which he does when he marries Martha Custis in 1759. And he is a member of the wealthy 100 by way of land speculation. He grows wealthy based on his land holdings. As a young man selling slaves, he sells slaves using a raffle. He would raffle slaves off at auctions. Raffle. Why would you raffle them? It's as opposed to auctioning them. When you raffle them off, you thereby ensure family separations. And George found it fun. Let me just, I think this was one of the most important speeches in American history, and don't take that as being some kind of an endorsement of LBJ, but his speech was a good speech, and I think we need to hear this.
Even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome. As a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are. I know how difficult it is to reshape the attitudes and the structure of our society. But a century has passed, more than 100 years, since the Negro was freed. And he is not fully freed tonight. It was more than 100 years ago that Abraham Lincoln, a great president of another party, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But emancipation is a proclamation and not a fact. A century has passed, more than 100 years, since equality was promised. And yet the Negro is not equal. A century has passed since the day of promise, and the promise is unkept. The time of justice has now come. And I tell you that I believe sincerely that no force can hold it back. It is right in the eyes of man and God that it should come. And when it does, I think that day will brighten the lives of every American. For Negroes are not the only victims. How many white children have gone uneducated? How many white families have lived in stark poverty? How many white lives have been scarred by fear because we've wasted our energy and our substance to maintain the barriers of hatred and terror? And so I say to all of you here and to all in the nation tonight, that those who appeal to you to hold on to the past do so at the cost of denying you your future. This great, rich, restless country can offer opportunity and education and hope to all black and white, all north and south, sharecropper and city dweller. These are the enemies. Poverty, ignorance, disease, they are our enemies, not our fellow man, not our neighbor. And these enemies too, poverty, disease, and ignorance, we shall overcome. But even if we pass this,
Oh, sorry.
the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part.
And so what I'm suggesting is that these issues, stealing Indian lands, killing them, enslaving people of color, hating them, they're all part of one overall phenomenon of greed, seeking ways to rationalize and justify what is unjustified and irrational. We can look at Tecumseh, and you can easily replace him today with Zelensky. You can look at what was being done to the Native Americans by chasing them off their lands and killing them in the process. And that's what's going on in Ukraine. We think, you know, look at how horrible that is. What do you think we did? I mean, that's not just to castigate America. It is to look at the broader pattern. It's not just America who did these things. This is a worldwide phenomenon that began 10,000 years ago. And I'm convinced that we cannot do something about it until we look at the big picture. Because what we wind up doing is trying to focus on one aspect, thinking that's going to cure the problem. It is a systemic worldwide problem, and we need to recognize it as such. America is but an example of it, and we need to be cognizant of that. Okay. Lauren, we can open up now for questions, comments, discussion.
Okay, so people can put their videos back on and raise your hand with questions or comments or whatever. And again, Sal, I think you just, there's so much to take in. I'm just personally going to say that I think that we see remnants of, well, not remnants, the ongoing same attitudes and behaviors that you're describing from some time ago.
Right.
Just hasn't.
No, that's what you're seeing in Buffalo. That's just it, you know, what happened in El Paso. I mean, it's all part of that phenomenon. And if we don't really look at the greater disease and we only focus on a symptom, don't think that it's going to be cured. I think Margita had her hand up. Are you there, Margita?
I would say too that somebody like that kid in Buffalo probably doesn't even understand why he feels the way he feels either. That it's so ingrained over so many generations that it's just a way of life. You know?
Yeah, it's not one of the points that I hope I'm trying to make is that it's not just one person reading some stuff and becoming radicalized. It is institutional. It is come through the culture. It's a much bigger phenomenon. Yes, it comes from family. It comes from family. It comes from church. It comes from school. It comes from the discussion in the gym. I mean, it is on TV. It's in theaters. We have to look. This message comes in many different forms. Go ahead, Margita, if you'll unmute.
Well, can you unmute there, Margita?
There
Can
you are.
you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. I wonder about the colonists who settled the West and the different areas of what is now the USA. Are they culpable to the same degree as those land speculators, etc.? I may be naive, but from what I know, there were quite a few number who were told that if they, went to a certain area and started building a home on there and starting to plant something, they could claim it as their own without any slaughtering of Native Americans who may have been there before. How do you see their role? And then even to another extreme, how about the urban immigrants who came later, and settled the big city, New York, etc.? They came after all of that. How should they look? I mean, they don't have any personal responsibility. I guess all we need is to see history for what it is. But are there innocent parties at all, or people who have been duped into certain roles?
I think we have to, what I think is important is, number one, to look at that broad picture of what's actually playing out. And people can be pawns in that performance. They may not know what they've signed up to, but mind you, even, once there was an illegal, and mind you, when I say illegal, I'm talking from the standpoint of however you view what might be legal or just or righteous. Mind you, the doctrine of discovery is incorporated into our law by way of Supreme Court rulings. So they are saying that gave the legal moral justification to go and take lands that other people inhabited. But from my perspective, that was, we have the court talking about how Roe v. Wade was wrong from the start. Well, I'm saying the doctrine of discovery was wrong from the start. Okay. And so it may, so I'm talking about from what I think of from a philosophy of what should be justice. And so when we invade and we occupy, that makes the whole thing illegitimate. Others may migrate 100 years later. But what they need to understand is that they have now settled in lands that are illegally occupied. So when we talk about those, the Eastern European migrations of the Polish and the Italians and others in the late 19th century, they're not themselves invaders, but what they bought into was coming into lands that were illegally occupied or immorally occupied. So it doesn't give them a right to the land. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but I know, I understand what you're saying, but it's a very complex issue. Since they did not know that when they came over, they were occupying land that was taken. So I think it's like in the courts. If you did not intend to, then are you culpable? And then what do you do with that?
Well, if I buy a piece of stolen art and I don't know it's stolen, but I buy it, I can lose what money I put to buy that art, right? So all I'm saying is that I'm not judging the future immigrants or those who were the Western settlers who were operating under the Homestead Act. But what I'm saying is what I'm suggesting is that was an injustice that was perpetrated against Native Americans at that time. And we need to be honest about it. What we have done is we have presented, I know from the time I was in school, and it's being corrected today, although there are government actions to try to reverse corrections, but there were only a handful of savages in the Americas. There weren't a lot of them. So we didn't go off and kill people. We just had a wagon train that went off and they went to virgin lands and they settled it and they became the indigenous people. I mean, there's a whole thing about the settler colonialist being characterized as indigenous. Why? Because, well, there was nobody there. We just settled it. It was virgin land. What we removed from the story was that, no, there were 100 million Native Americans in the Americas at the time of the colonial invasion.
Yeah. So looking forward, those of us who are not afraid to look at the truth, the historic truth, and then teach that to our children and grandchildren, what is our responsibility? Are there any reparations possible anymore? What should be done to kind of, put some weight on justice? What can be done? What should the future generation do?
Yeah, it's interesting, Margita. I've had that question raised, many times in classes like this, and I refrain from having, an answer, because I think it is a complex answer that needs to, be given a lot of thought, a lot of debate, a lot of analysis. I don't think there's a simple, pay reparations of this amount and you'll make people whole. I don't believe that is possible. I do believe there, as opposed to reparations, I'm looking for reconciliation. How can we reconcile what happened with what we have now? How do we make the victims whole in some sense? I don't know the answer to that, but I would like for serious people to, use a wide range of expertise to come up with a comprehensive answer to that. And I don't want to pretend like I know the answers. I don't. I have ideas. I have a lot of things that I would like to input into it. I think there's, stuff that can be done in the short term, midterm, and long term. So, and I think we need to approach it in that sense. But I think it would be an injustice for me to say this is the way we reconcile it. I think it's complicated. And a lot of what really was my kind of responsibility in life was to kind of define the problem, make some recommendations for solving it, but that truly my role was to, can we get real information about what took place here, what the problem is?
Yeah,
and so people can actually see it. Yeah.
Sorry, but as a postscript here, of course, for those of us who would then like to teach that, and I'm a teacher myself, retired now in school, now we're not allowed to. How we're ever getting to the point where the truth is told in its unblemished form. Now we're told that this would create a dilemma, psychological, mental problems for our students. And, partially it's true because it will create unease and possibly even a feeling of misplaced guilt in teenagers who understand the concept better than children. But I mean, when we teach this is why I'd like to have something concrete to give our children to translate into action, because it is disturbing. And I know I have a granddaughter who is 6 and one who's 7, and they're very sensitive about issues like this. So, and they take it on.
Sure. No, I understand. It's look, I think we need to have truth in education. I have to, in doing classes for intelligence people, what I would say to them is there are standards for how you gather information. There are standards to try to address bias in how you pull together facts. There's ways in which we should conduct an analysis that rise it up to a level of credibility. And we can debate all of those elements, but we kind of know what they are. And so the objective is provide credible data, information. Don't, if you're hedging it to please an audience in any way, that's what you should not be doing. Just present what it is, and then we'll go from there. So, yeah. Hi, Gail.
Hi, Sal. Once again, always very thought-provoking. One of the things that comes to mind for me is culture clashes, and different from the deplorable no moral constraint tools and methods that were used, but still, because of the last remarks about what about these settlers who were moving westward and all, it looked to them probably as if the lands were empty because of a different culture. The Indian tribes didn't draw lines around a piece of property. This is mine. All these, the migrations, the cattle, their own spending different time in different areas in different seasons, what all of that, they needed that clip you showed about how the tribes were moving across the lands that they had moved across for eons and suddenly found things in the way. Other people had set up fortifications and were armed to the teeth and wouldn't let them pass. So that's like, and cultures build in assumptions about how things work and then impose those assumptions on other cultures. We kind of do that with the Western, weird societies, Western educated, industrialized, democratic, whatever it is, anyway, that we impose our assumptions about how life works and cultural structures on other countries. Like it's sort of like it want to impose democracy on all these other countries around the world that are not democratic, and who are we to say that this is how they ought to run their business? And so I think I totally agree that the greed and the power to stay in power and the loss of moral guide rails is horrifying. But part of the thing that needs to be addressed is this issue of cultural disconnects and how do different cultures coexist? How could the settlers have still accommodated the need for the native tribes to migrate? Anyway, just something else to think about.
No, look, I think it's a very good point. And it just spurs memory of when we were doing Afghanistan. We approach it like we want democracy, we want everyone to vote, we want equality for women, women should be able to vote. This is how we view it. Afghanis did not view it that way. Now there were different, you have to understand there's the urban environment of Kabul versus the countryside. Those are two very different worlds. Yeah. In the countryside, it's not extraordinary to find women are not allowed to go outside.
Oh, yeah.
They're not allowed to be seen by a man. Now, I might not like that, but that is their culture. And when you come and you say, no, we're going to change all that, the kind of internal turmoil that it put people into was horrible. And you can say, well, but we're doing it for good purpose. Women should be treated. Well, I understand that, but that's our culture, not theirs. And when you are going to come and bully your culture into theirs, don't think, it's not a good thing.
Well, and for it to be imposed one culture upon another is part of the problem. Culture is not a static thing, it's dynamic. I was in Afghanistan twice, and what I found, you're right, very, very different in the cities than rural, but we were hosted all over the place by warlords. Americans call them warlords, who were very gracious and very honorable in their own honor system people. And I spent a lot of time with women. I was sort of an honorary man, so I got to have sit in the councils and the dinners and stuff with men. But I also saw a lot that the men in my parties did not see, because I was adopted by the women and taken into their whole world that my husband never saw. And I met women who were very attached to the security and the tradition and the whatever of wearing the burqa and all of that, and thought it was good. But also many young women who would approach me and want to talk about wanting to not be constrained by this, and tell me stories about their friend who fell in the river and drowned because she was wearing a burqa. They got wet and she couldn't swim, and there were these, like, it's an impediment and it's a terrible. And so, but that kind of change can happen organically inside a culture from the inside as the next generation looks around and makes choices. But that's way different from an external culture moving in and imposing a change that we think we know what's right and what's better for you. And perhaps there are underlying motivations for wanting to impose that change that have to do with wealth and greed.
Yeah. Well, because those kinds of conflicts become tools for exploitation by people who want to exploit. It's I said to one person, this person who's the head of this organization and is doing a lot of racist stuff and ginning people up, they may not be racist themselves. How could that be? That's a horrible person. That person just knows that that's a tool that works and that serves a political purpose. So
well, that's horrible in itself. They're not racist, but they're amoral, and that's horrible in itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gail.
Oh, do we have any other questions or comments out there? The heat's getting that to everybody.
Okay, well, I will send you out some stuff, some excerpts from this latest book by Dunbar Ortiz. And next week, we are going to move, it will be our last session of this series. And we're going to look at the French and Indian War, which many relate to as the first worldwide war. So there are things that are going on with the French and Indian War that are impacting wars in Europe, and how the French and how the British sought to undermine each other by supporting other wars and that kind of thing. So it really does become a prelude to what is the worldwide wars of the 20th century. And so we're going to examine that next week. And thank you all for coming today, and we'll see you next week.
Everybody can give Sal a little. Thank you very much.
Sal.
Thank you.